So we got to get right to it. Folks have been very, very patient in terms of our lineup of guests. We've run very, very long because of all the issues surrounding the budget impasse / Pawtucket Red Sox crony capitalism. But joining us on the line is Bryon Schlomach. He is the policy director of an organization called the 1889 Institute, working in conjunction with the Goldwater Institute, no stranger to the coalition. They have come across what I think is a pioneering, fascinating study. He talks about the importance of the cost of living and policies to address it. Bryon, thank you so much for your patience tonight, and thank you for joining the coalition live on Skype. How are you tonight?
I'm doing great. It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
No, absolutely. Folks, if you go to our Facebook announcement on the show, you'll see a direct link to the Goldwater Institute as well as a copy of the study. We will be putting a copy of the study up on the coalitionradio.us website this weekend so you can download it. Let me see if I can get my arms around this, because this to me, this is what we call at the coalition an onion issue. And what I mean by that, as you peel away the different layers, additional layers of import are exposed. If you look at any one of a number of governmental analyses, and we're wonk heaven here at the coalition, we don't apologize, we are wonk and proud, all right? So if you look at any of the studies surrounding how we spend money on education, on how we look at if you're of the type to support income redistribution, well, we're not at the coalition, but if you're the type that supports that, your analysis is based on a certain set of facts. If you look at how we allocate medical funding, literally everything we do in government is based, really, when you boil it down to it, one certain set of numbers. And Bryon, feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but by and large, those numbers are a single set of facts, which is a reflection of the per capita income in a given state. What Bryon's study does is essentially point out the fraud in that, and I mean that in the most gentlest way possible, because ultimately, and this is one of those issues, and it's so much more complicated than this my simple recitation of it, but this is one of those issues where when someone articulates it to you, it's been in the back of your mind. You weren't clear on how to look at it, certainly how to analyze it, but the big issue here is that when we look at states, we simply fail to analyze, or traditionally we fail to analyze, the impact of the cost of living in that state, and then as a result, how we should look back on those numbers. Is that a fair analysis?
That's fair. Look, the issue here is different states have different costs of living. Mm-hmm. Texas, for example, is a fairly low cost of living state. I live in the third lowest cost of living state, Oklahoma. Meanwhile, California is a very high cost of living state. Most of the Northeast states are high cost of living. There are several issues that arise when you start considering the cost of living. One is, mostly northeastern states are considered more prosperous than, say, Oklahoma and even Texas, even though Texas has been growing a lot. Because you look at the per capita incomes in the northeast states, you look at the per capita income in California, and you think, wow, those are wealthy states.
And let me jump in for a second. There's a certain, and I'll use the word, there's a certain element of what I'll call economic bigotry in that, because living in the Northeast as I do, you use the example of Mississippi throughout your paper. We look down on Mississippi because it's, quote unquote, a poor state. And
That's right, of course.
And yet, I've got the feeling after reading through most of your study that the people in Mississippi, every time they hear that are laughing at us because they actually know better, don't they?
I think they do. The cost of living in Mississippi is the lowest in the country. And because it's the lowest in the country, their dollars stretch a lot farther than Californians' dollars do, and so they're better off than California once you adjust for the cost of living. Mm-hmm. They're better off than Rhode Island. They're better off than a lot of states once you adjust for the cost of living. And Oklahoma, which in the personal income per capita statistics ranks 29, once you adjust for cost of living, we rise to 12th. Mm-hmm. Texas goes to 7th. from 25th to 7th. And most of the Northeast states that are in the top 10 under the traditional statistics drop out of the top 10 and drop considerably. And so Oklahoma is better off than Massachusetts, as it turns out.
Right.
Once you adjust for the cost of living. So there's that aspect of the issue where we're really being kind of deceived about how well off we are. Then there's the aspect of, well, we are also flowing federal dollars based on the poverty rate or the poverty level of income, which is uniform according to federal statistics, the way they distribute their money. That's a uniform amount of money across the 48 states. But of course, the federal poverty level of income doesn't go as far in Rhode Island or New York or California as it does in Mississippi, Oklahoma, and Texas. So in many respects, as I argue in the paper, blue states, the relatively liberal, high-cost states, actually get hosed a little bit when it comes to their share of federal money, while the red states, because we're low cost and people are actually doing pretty well at the federal poverty level, or relatively well, we're getting a lion's share of the fund. But on the other hand, high cost of living states, it's their own fault. It's their policies that have driven up the cost of living there.
Right, and that's by and large one of the significant takeaways. Now you point out quite adroitly, and when you talk about gross domestic product, first off, I've seen very little, I'll call it non-academic research focused on the gross domestic product of an individual state. We typically look at the GDP of the nation. In terms of literature aimed at the average person like myself, you see very little conversation about it. You dive right into that. Reducing the cost of living, that is making government more effective and government less intrusive, ultimately, while it may not increase the raw GDP numbers, the carrying strength of that GDP is exponentially increased, correct?
That's exactly right. If you drop the cost of living in California by 10%, which sounds like a lot, but it still wouldn't be down to the level of the cost of living in Oklahoma. But if you drop their cost of living by 10%, that's the same as increasing their GDP by 10% in terms of spending power.
Right.
And they're better off by 10%. And the other thing that's happening with these high cost of living states is people with relatively modest income just really can't survive. And so they're leaving those states. They're coming to states like Oklahoma.
Right.
And there are positives and negatives to that, but the bottom line is that what seems to be happening is relatively wealthy, and as it turns out the way they vote, relatively liberal, people are being left behind, and they're voting in policies that actually make the situation even worse.
Right.
Like, for example, minimum wages. And so a lot of these states that are high cost of living states have relatively high minimum wages, and that, according to the statistics, the analysis that I've done, actually contributes to the problem, which, of course, makes sense that it would. And so it's a phenomenon that seems to be feeding on itself, partly out of ideology, partly out of the mistaken idea that everything is ultimately about GDP. Yeah, you get the statistics, the raw statistics. California looks like it's doing really well. It's one of the biggest economies in the world if it were its own nation. But the reality is that it's misleading because the money there isn't as valuable as it is in other places.
Now, you cite several reasons, and You and I didn't have a chance to speak going into this, but for the record, I'm the chairman of the Rhode Island Libertarian Party, so I have a feeling you and I are going to agree on a lot of things today. I'm smart like that. I got that sense. Anytime government and let's use college tuition as an example. Anytime subsidies are involved, once we get past the heartwarming aspect of subsidies effectively act to drive up the cost of a product, don't they? I mean,
they really do. Look, government. It's interesting. I wrote an essay a long time ago about, is government just unlucky, or just what exactly is going on? Everything government touches, they have more inflation in that area, like healthcare, higher education, public education, than in any other area in the economy. And the story is basically, look, when the government subsidizes a particular area in a big way, people run up the prices. Producers know that the government is out there paying for these products, and they charge extra high prices because they know they can get away with it. The government, people in the government, it's not their money. They're not being particularly price sensitive. However, the issues that I look at specifically in this paper and in the statistical analysis don't really even get into subsidies or taxes. It gets into regulatory aspects of what the government does to us. And when you think about taxes, because it's a redistribution, when you're looking at prices in the economy as a whole, not just in a particular area, the government, is bidding up prices in some areas, but because they're taking money away from us, prices have to fall in other areas. And so it kind of evens out when you're looking at price indexes. But when you look at regulation, there's no place to go but up when it comes to prices. And you mentioned the fact that you're a libertarian, and I have some strong libertarian tendencies, but the reality is this was probably the most data-driven, completely data-driven analysis I've ever done, where I did not start with a preconceived notion of any kind whatsoever. I discovered some data, I asked a few questions, ran a few what are called statistical regressions, and holy cow, I was getting these crazy good results.
Right.
It was the data that led me to my conclusions, not the other way around, not at all.
Right.
And so, they're very, but then that speaks to the power of the libertarian philosophy, which is, look, what we're really looking at is just reality. We're not making assumptions about people's natures that are kind of ridiculous.
No. In fact, when I read some of the interviews you've done, I guess there's a publication out there called the Okie, which is a local blog in Oklahoma. I'm gonna use a word track and tell me what you think of this. It's something my listeners have been subjected to for a couple of years now. But I talk about capitalism being the mechanism by which the individual can reach their full human potential. That's alarmingly like one of the quotes that I read that you made to the Okie, where you see capitalism not as something being inflicted on people. That's cronyism, that's corporatism, that's not capitalism. Capitalism is actually a tool for people to use their hard work and their skills and their risk capital to grow and provide benefits to other people through their ability to invest in others' work ethic, their efforts, and provide risk capital to others. So you and I uniquely agree on that, and the fact that emotions really, we're all emotional, but when looking at results, as our former president would have said, we have to be results orientated, because too often we look at results through the gauze of human emotions. And no one can accuse you in this study of doing that. Thank goodness. It's as Sergeant Friday would say, it's just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Now, you talk about several of the key ingredients into this unholy mix. That let's be blunt. We're talking about a lower standard of living for areas that are over-regulated and overburdened by the increasing costs of government. It's not just the income thing. We're talking about an overall lower standard of living for people, particularly in the blue Northeast states. Rhode Island, by the way, for the record, folks, I'll make it easy for you. Here's the big one. Rhode Island, in your study, came out 42nd out of a state of 50, out of 50 states, 51. You included the District of Columbia. Despite the fact that we're in the center between Boston and New York, despite the fact that we're a coastal state, we should be drawing economic advantages from that, despite the fact that we have Ivy League and top universities here in the state, despite all of that, our insistence on regulation and governmental burdens really, let's be blunt, have lowered our standard of living. And that's really what it comes down to for you, isn't it?
That's exactly right. There are 8 areas that I've identified of government regulation that lend significantly. I'm not going to say that there aren't other factors, but these factors,
right.
The statistics speak strongly to these factors impacting the cost of living, and that is land use regulation, especially in the form of zoning. And there are different aspects to that, waiting periods, things like that, but Rhode Island doesn't figure particularly well in that particular area. Rhode Island is rated as having pretty intrusive zoning type regulations. It's interesting, states with right to work laws are associated with a lower cost of living, and Rhode Island does not have a right to work law. And I would argue that not having a right to work law is actually a regulation. Mm-hmm. In that you end up having to join a union. Just a couple of states impose this requirement for additional disability insurance on the part of employers. Rhode Island is one of those, and that adds to the cost of living. Energy regulation. Rhode Island isn't too bad in that area, but the more regulated you are, the more monopolistic your energy market is, and we're talking mainly about electricity here, the higher the cost of living. If you have a higher minimum wage than the federal minimum wage, the higher the minimum wage, the higher the cost of living. And Rhode Island is in that camp with that relatively high minimum wage. Mm-hmm. Startup and filing costs for businesses, that's another area that Rhode Island is lacking in. It imposes relatively high costs. And I know I've talked to people about this, and they say, well, look, those costs really aren't that high. But those tend to be also associated with delays in getting a business started, and that adds to the cost. Imposing additional family leave regulations, again, Rhode Island does that. And then an area where, surprisingly enough, Rhode Island is strong in. In other words, it's on the positive side of the ledger, is a lower percentage of its workforce is licensed than many states, including Oklahoma. That is one area Oklahoma could improve in a lot. In fact, we had the percentage of our workforce license that Rhode Island does would be equivalent to putting probably about $1,000 in every man, woman, and child's pocket in this state. But so that's one area where Rhode Island has a strength. I don't know if that's because of its size and because of the accessibility to other states, and maybe the license profession in those states or what, but only about less than 15% of Rhode Island's workforce is licensed, whereas almost 22% in the nation is licensed.
Well, it's interesting because that would be a great study in and of itself if someone had the time and the funding, because one could almost argue that because the economy is so underdeveloped here, there's less demand for licensed professions, electrical things like that. The tricky thing about economics is that there are so many countervailing trends that require to be boiled down, and that's, we're engaged in one of the things that made us so long tonight was that we're engaged in this battle against a major a baseball stadium subsidy, and a lot of the, obviously as a libertarian, I'm direly opposed to that. I mean, we're talking about $40 million, which for a state like Rhode Island is real money. I believe you have a AAA baseball team in Oklahoma as well. So if you should ever catch them, the Paw Sox come into town, we expect you to raise the libertarian flag there and say say something like, no money for millionaires, and then watch the team turn around. Don't yell, no, hey batter, hey batter, hey batter. Say, hey, no, no bonds for crony capitalists, and then you'll get their attention. All right, but again, and now I'm going to appeal to my liberal friends, of which I have many. If the overall concern, and again, I get back to the standard of living argument, if the overall concern is the standard of living to people across economic boundaries, what I find fascinating about your study is that it gives lie to the notion that we are somehow helping these people by protecting them with all these laws, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We are definitely hurting people. In fact, what we're doing is we're helping those who have higher incomes. The way I put it is, it's like the people who are relatively wealthy have climbed up a rope ladder of success and have pulled the last few rungs up behind them. Mm-hmm. And because what you've done with zoning is you've made housing more expensive.
Right.
So if you're relatively well off, you've got your house, you've got your little piece of heaven, but you're supporting zoning which denies someone else their piece of heaven at a lower price than they can get in your state now because of your regulation. Same sort of thing with minimum wages, which overwhelmingly favor middle class and upper middle class teenagers more than anybody else. But they hurt all the other teenagers out there. And so there again, you pulled up a rung of the rope ladder of success and denied other people that first rung to get up that ladder.
Right.
And ultimately, I think what's happening is these blue states, they're kind of assuaging their guilt a little bit by offering even better social benefits. But guess what? They may offer better social benefits, but because of the high cost of living, they probably don't go as far as we'd like to think that they go.
Right.
And consequently, a lot of those folks are moving to states like, again, Oklahoma, the southern states, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, these relatively less regulated states. Even so, you look at per capita incomes, and again, Rhode Island is 18th if you look at just the standard statistics in terms of personal income per capita in the nation. As you mentioned earlier, Rhode Island drops to 42nd when the cost of living is taken into account. Realize that puts Rhode Island behind Kentucky. It puts Rhode Island behind Mississippi. It puts Rhode Island behind Alabama, Arkansas, as well as Florida, and even behind Louisiana. And so, holy cow, Rhode Island is only hurting itself ultimately with these regulations, and everyone in that state would actually be better off, except for the very wealthy who, in my little town of Piedmont, Oklahoma, where I live, someone was recently appointed, as it turns out, to the city council, and they said something about wanting more developments that were 5 acres or more per house. Basically what they're doing is they're saying, I don't want to live around poor people.
Right.
And that's kind of happened in the Northeast. It's kind of what's happened in California.
Right. An example that I'll use, this actually happened in Boston a few years back. Walmart attempted to enter the city of Boston. And because of the politics surrounding the Walmart name, you had all the self-righteous folks getting up and saying, I refuse to shop at a Walmart. Well, of course, that's your choice. As someone in a free market, you have the choice that if you choose to avoid a certain business because of social issues, God bless America. But the mayor, the late mayor, a guy named Menino, often referred to as Mumbles Menino, refused to very high-minded, refused to grant Walmart the permit because of their politics. And I pointed out at the time that talk to a single mom who currently lives in what's called a food desert in a city where there are no independent or larger supermarkets, who has to go to a bodega, local, corner store and pay $5 for a quart of milk. Tell the single mom how self-righteous you are when she could go to Walmart and pay $2 for a gallon of milk. And that's the beauty of the free market, because ultimately, by allowing Walmart, as distasteful as you may or may not find their business practices, but they're legal, allowing them in, you've effectively, by your argument, increased the reach of the gross domestic product in that particular microeconomy. And I can't think of a more compelling example of how politics and a sort of a perverse form of economic racism, I'll call it that, that's not your words, mine, all right, actually create a situation where those that we purport to help are being desperately harmed. Desperately.
Oh, exactly. Exactly. You're exactly right. Nearly everything that we do with social programs that are designed to help certain people, it's backfiring. You can go, oh my goodness, the writings of Thomas Sowell, the economist from the Hoover Institution who happens to be black.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, to me, he has hit the nail on the head for years, where he pointed out, look, if you look at the statistics, every statistic, blacks were better off prior to the civil rights laws in the mid-'60s than after.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that is probably not the civil rights laws themselves that caused that. It's the Great Society that was implemented at about the same time. Mm-hmm. And because of the incentives that those benefits create, mm-hmm. we actually harm people, not help them. And he has pointed that out so eloquently over the years.
Well, the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan pointed that out. Now, he was considered a liberal lion, but he pointed out how the Great Society effectively destroyed the inner city and black or white family structure and replaced it effectively with the welfare state. And that
exactly.
The family structure, which for many years had depended so much on churches and other forms of private family-based charity, now were destroyed and replaced almost exclusively by state-sponsored charity, which again drives up the cost of living, drives up the cost of doing business, and has this perverse impact. Another example I often use is in the Boston economy, very little mention, and I'm not sure how much time you spend up in New England, but in Boston the economy is white hot. A lot of that has to do with the biomedical industry, with the great universities that are there. Folks very rarely talk about the need for the $15 an hour minimum wage there for one simple reason. Because of this explosive economy, wage levels for folks with any skill set whatsoever are quite frankly higher than that. Because if you were to offer someone a $10 or $12 wage, you simply wouldn't be able to hire someone, because you've got, to me, the desired effect. A much more free market economy, say, than the rest of New England, coupled with some organic ingredients for success, universities, the biomedical industry, have created an economy where there is opportunity for all. And it's that, when I say all, it's not a function of race or religion, ethnic origin, it's a function of work ethic and skill sets. And so if the economy then is allowed to operate efficiently and deliver people an education that gives them the skill sets they need to then compete in that same economy, then all are served. But if we continue to try and structure economy, have a planned economy, then eventually those gains are lost. And what it seems remarkable about your study is that it directly, empirically, being the operative word, supports just that. And that's what I think a lot of folks, for me, why I'm so excited by your work, a lot of folks like me, who are, again, sort of, armchair economists, wannabes, I've been starving for just that set of empirical data explained the way you do. You do a remarkable job, as does the Goldwater Institute. I'm now becoming familiar with the 1889 people, of making it accessible. And that's kind of the special sauce that's often lacking in academic pursuits. So I applaud you for that, and that's why we're going to do everything we can to get your study out, so people read it and take a look at it, and hopefully puncture some sacred, some urban legends and skewer some sacred cows, if you will. What, like, for example, talk to us. We only got a few minutes. We've gone way over, but I wanted so much to have you on the show. What is Oklahoma doing right now in terms of its economy that's given it such a positive spin under this different perspective that you provided?
Well, it is a low regulation state. Most of the things that I mentioned earlier, Oklahoma doesn't have really that big of a problem with. There are some things that seem to be developing, like zoning, for example. There have been some instances where Walmarts have been blocked, and there are instances I can cite in Oklahoma City where zoning has played an excessive role in determining how land is used. However, for the most part, Oklahoma is a fairly wide open state when it comes to starting and running a business here, and how you use your land and your property and develop it. The worst thing about Oklahoma is the occupational licensing. And in that particular area, they have a commission going right now where they're looking at ways to curb that. So they're already looking at what can we do to solve a particular problem. And this was something they started long before this study came out. Mm-hmm. And so that's the different perspective you have in Oklahoma and in a state like Texas, which is my native state, compared to states that are up in the Northeast. We're constantly looking for ways to get government out of our lives, while it seems that people in the Northeast are thinking that government is the solution to everything in their lives. And so you look at situations like Boston, it's really kind of fascinating, the fact that California and Massachusetts are both highly regulated states, yet they can have these growth spurts in particular areas. And when you look at those particular areas, those are particular areas of the economy where there's a lot of innovation going on. There are a lot of synergies when you have a lot of people together, in other words, clustered, like you do with medicine in Boston and like you do with high tech in California. And they can kind of stay ahead of that cost curve and that income curve and that cost of living curve. But ultimately, that high cost of living will come home to roost for them.
Now, what's interesting is you have to be careful in Oklahoma, because I'll call it the Utah phenomenon. Years ago, Utah was and it still is to a large degree, a bastion of free enterprise. And mm-hmm. California's economy was crippled because one of the things that you point out is the cyclical nature of some of these economies, and the ebbs and flow of California's economy, particularly in the past with its extreme reliance on defense, led it to sort of up and down and up and down. So Californians all of a sudden saw Utah as this place to go. Low cost of living, high tech, explosive growth, great universities, great schools, solid family structure. So the problem is that the people from California who were so desirous of this moved to Utah, and guess what they brought with them? They tried to turn Utah into, California.
Exactly.
And the same thing happened out here with New Hampshire. There's a pejorative term applied to Massachusetts that harkens into geology, if you will, but it begins with Mass. And a lot of the Mass moved up to New Hampshire, and again, they didn't go up to New Hampshire and say, boy, we admire your free market nature, your independence, your self-reliance. No, they did not. They tried and actually succeeded in turning a good part of southern New Hampshire into northern Massachusetts. So I don't know how you break out of that cycle of violence, if you will, because
that's a good question. And I know that's what you're describing happened in Colorado. It's happening in Arizona. Mm-hmm. It is happening here to some extent. Yes, there are a lot of Californians moving to Oklahoma, just like there are Californians moving to Texas. Texas is so big that it can absorb a lot of them. But if you look at Travis County, where Austin is, mm-hmm. it's a little California.
It's Portland South, Portland, Oregon South. And here's to me what the missing ingredient is. We've just spent, without getting into all of it, because my listeners have heard this before, but we've just spent the better part of 3 years arguing about subsidizing a baseball stadium, of all things. Now, the state of Rhode Island is broke. It's beyond broke. If there was a case to be made for a state going bankrupt, Rhode Island clearly, just in terms of its pension obligations, all the usual stuff. We're reflecting tonight on what's been missing from the argument. Astonishingly enough, after 3 years of back and forth, and it's kind of had its ebbs and flows, but we've just had 2 major Senate hearings here in Rhode Island where hundreds of people attended and testified. Not a single economist was to be found amongst them, particularly arguing on behalf of the baseball team owners. And it's this fundamental ignorance of basic economics. I'm not talking that you have to become a microeconomics expert. I'm not talking that you have to dive into any of that. I'm talking about good old Econ 101. Years ago with Samuelson, I don't know who's doing the textbook now, but I'm talking about a freshman course in economics. Understanding price elasticity, understanding the substitution effect, understanding the marginal propensity to fill in the blank, understanding the multiplier effect, if you will, understanding how government money spent does not have the same level of exponential growth and a multiplier effect that, say, private money does. We're not talking about really complicated issues, are we? I mean, it's fun. For someone like yourself, it's almost laughable, but there's a stunning ignorance in this nation, not only of civics, I think we can all agree on that, but of fundamental baseline economics. That Econ 101 course we all had to suffer through in as a freshman in college, in between beers. My exam, not yours, of course. But
I agree. Look, economists have probably done a bad job, I would argue, of making the case for how strong our way of thinking really is. Mm-hmm. I think part of it is that there are plenty of economists who are ideologues first, and before they're economists, and I would put Paul Krugman in that camp, mm-hmm. Who despite their education in economics, despite all the data that they've seen, and frankly, economics is really just formalized common sense.
Right.
Despite the common sense they see, they still hold on to these sacred cows that they believe in, and it mixes the message from economics. And so I think because of that, some of the courses that economists teach are overly technical and lose people in a sea of detail instead of looking at the bigger picture and illustrating the real common sense and power behind economics.
Right.
But you're exactly right. Most people are unbelievably ignorant of economic reasoning. It's not that hard. My father's a medical doctor, and I would argue that in his own intuitive way, he was a better economist than most PhDs I've ever known. Uh-huh. And that tells you the tragedy of an over-reliance on equations and formalism in our profession. And frankly, like you say earlier, this paper probably could have been published in an academic journal, but only about a dozen people might have read it. Right. And it would have been written in such a way that a regular person wouldn't have been able to make heads or tails of it. And as it is, yes, I worked very hard at trying to make it accessible to the average person. And yeah, it has a technical appendix, but even that, I would argue, is written in such a way that anybody with even a smattering knowledge of the statistical methods used would read it and understand it pretty well.
We certainly applaud your efforts. We've gone way over, but I just want you to talk to me. Folks who watch the show regularly are very familiar with the Goldwater Institute, a wonderful think tank that certainly, obviously by its name, was spawned from a very conservative mindset, but even organizations like the New York Times have applauded its humanity, its the common sense, the accessibility, and the real-world perspective it provides. Now, the 1889 Institute, I'm not that familiar with. I'm assuming your title spans from what the Sooners and the original land grab in Oklahoma.
That's exactly right.
But to just tell us a little bit about that and where folks can find your work on an ongoing basis.
Sure. The 1889 Institute, we do a research in a number of areas. We work at just producing research. We are not a lobbying organization. We're a 501c3 educational organization, and we look into areas like welfare, education, cronyism, and just overall economic freedom. We're a small organization. Basically, now that someone just left us, it's me and one other guy.
Oh, but hey, it's the quality of work. It's
That's right. But we can be found on the web. We recently put a new coat of paint on our website. It's the 1889institute.org. Leave off the V. 1889institute.org using the digits. And like I say, I'm proud of the new look of the website. It's easy to find material on. It's designed to be user friendly. We have a number of different resources. Most of it's focused on Oklahoma, but not all of it is. And this paper in particular, I'll be posting on our website as well as Goldwater having it on their website.
Great. Well, again, we applaud your efforts. It's great stuff. I hope you'll put us on your mailing list and keep us apprised of anything you're doing. You're welcome on the show anytime. It's this kind of real world perspective on important issues that does so much to provide real truth to people. And right now, in an age where clearly there's little or no respect for truth and facts and issues, when folks can put together salient, cogent pieces like this, you serve the community very well, not just Oklahoma, but the nation at large. So congratulations, and again, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking with you. I really enjoyed it.
Well, good. And again, if you make it up to Providence, but I need you. The next, what is it? The Oklahoma. I'll find out the name of the baseball team. But if you make it up here to Socialist Workers Paradise here in Rhode Island, let us know. We'll provide you a safe house, a form of ID, and we'll get you through the safely. Okay?
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, buddy. God bless. Folks, okay, again, we're talking with Bryon Schlomach of the 1889 Institute, who published, and we're going to put up the study on the website, a fascinating look and analysis of the realities of income numbers, what they really mean when decoded through the level of a cost of living. On one level, it sounds so elemental and so, as we say in the coalition, commonsensical, but no one's done it. And it changes everything. It really changes your perspective on just about everything we do. And the notion that someone actually took the time to provide empirical evidence to some of my long cherished, heartfelt beliefs, I am grateful for forever. So, folks, we're running about 25 minutes late. Hopefully Josh isn't watching right now. But folks, this has been yet another production of the Coalition, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Media Network here on the Go Local Live Broadcast Center.